Professor Daniel Schwarz has long been a fixture at Cornell, where he's taught since 1968. An active member of the English department faculty, his teaching portfolio is extensive. Topics of courses he has taught include the British novel, especially late 19th and 20th century topics, Victorian and modern poetry, James Joyce, American and European fiction, Holocaust studies, urban studies, literary theory, and modernism. He has published 17 books on wide-ranging topics, most recently an analysis of the New York Times in the 21st century, and also European novels before 1900, with an emphasis on early modern fiction, poetry, culture, and readership. In addition to his well-known works of scholarship about humanist subjects, he has also published his own fiction and poetry. Since 2007, Professor Schwarz has held the title of Frederic J. Whiton Professor of English Literature. His awards include the Stephen H. Weiss Presidential Fellowship for Distinguished Teaching and the Stephen and Marjorie Russell Distinguished Teaching Award. Today, Professor Schwarz will discuss his latest book, How to Succeed in College and Beyond, published by Wiley-Blackwell last February, in which he advises undergraduates in maintaining a balance between the joy of learning and the necessity of career preparation. Approaching 50 years as a college professor, Professor Schwarz draws on substantial personal experience in compiling material for this volume. Part guide, part advice manual, his new book celebrates the value of the humanities, which champion effective writing, articulate speech, and critical thinking. Professor Schwarz.
That over here. Thank you, Bonnie, for that gracious introduction. This is a trick lecture for me because I'm going to try to say something that's interesting to professional colleagues and also to who are also teachers, and something for the students. So it's kind of a mixed audience, and probably it's going to be difficult to do everything right here. I did a version of this at Rose House where I had all students, and that was a little easier. I should probably mention the genealogy of this book. Some years ago, I started to be invited by Alumni Magazine at Cornell and places like that, and some op-eds to write about various aspects of undergraduate education. I think it started with a request to write an article comparing current students with the students in the feisty late 60s and early 70s. And then I wrote an article that got some attention called What Do You Do with a BA in English?, which kind of tried to show that that our English majors weren't living in garages and in the basement, and that they had jobs. So gradually, then somebody came to some talk I gave from Huffington and asked me to write some articles on higher education for the Huffington Post. So this went on for a couple of years, and then Wiley-Blackwell came and asked me if I wanted to do a book. And I was a little hesitant because some of my original pieces were not really fully research pieces. So what I did at that point is I got a lot more facts in some of the areas that I talked about, say the numbers for applying to college and how to get financial aids. And I talked to people who were knowledgeable and got much more statistics on the value of education. And the other thing I did was I circulated, and I had been doing that, but I did it more intentionally, the Huffingtons to teachers, students, administrators, not only at Cornell, but other places. And some of the more pointed comments are in the book. So it's both my opinions, and it's supplemented by some views from other people and other perspectives at other universities. So that's sort of how the book came to be. And the book is being marketed as sort of a how to succeed at college, and that's certainly very much part of it. It tries to balance the joy of learning with the practicality of learning, meaning that people need jobs and people need to figure out how to go to graduate school. And the book is divided into 5 parts. The first part is called Beginnings, and it talks, the first chapter, which I won't mention much of today, is called How to Prepare for College, and it talks about what people can do in terms of getting internships, in terms of balancing academics with extracurricular activity, and to prepare themselves for college, and also to learn about the resources for financial aid. The second chapter, actually there's an introductory chapter, but the next chapter is called the College Olympics, and that's one has gotten a fair amount of attention. It's called How to Choose the Right College and How to Get the Right College to Choose You. And that, I'll speak a little about this, but there aren't too many people who are applying to college at this point. But what I found out in this, and I sat in with admissions here and talked to quite a few people in this field, what we discovered is that most students get into the tier or the approximate tier, or maybe a half a tier below what they should get into. That is, the system is not as difficult as we are told it is. The statistics that as one person gets in out of 20 or something at Harvard is partly skewed by the fact that the common application makes everybody apply to enormous numbers of schools, and they write a few sentences to show why separately why they love school X or school Y. But somebody, and this is not to insult anything, somebody doesn't get into MIT, so they come to Cornell for engineering. Somebody doesn't get into Cornell, they go to Lehigh. In other words, it tends to work itself out. People who want to do arts and science at Yale, maybe then they come here, or if they want to do it here, they go to Colgate. But the point is, or to Bates, the point is that the system is not working as badly as we think it is. And that's one piece of good news. The second piece of good news, as Frank Bruni, with whom I was on a panel last year, says, it doesn't matter that much where you do your undergraduate degree if you're within the range of respectable. He went to North Carolina. He's doing fine, obviously. So people, it's less important than it seems. The third piece of good news is that when the people who come from these urban hothouse areas where you go to college is on everybody's mind to the point of torturing themselves and their children and the school system, most of these, as soon as people get here, even if they wanted to be somewhere else, it all works itself out, and people tend to be happy and satisfied. And the fourth is, if they're not, transferring is not that hard. So all of these things we discovered, and there's a lot more in the book about this. And another thing we discovered, and this had been somewhat publicized in the media, sometimes going to an elite school where scholarship aid is given on needs-based actually becomes less expensive than going to a school with lower tuition. And some of you who are here may know that, because some of the schools are giving massive aid packages. We can't keep up with Yale or Harvard, Princeton, or Stanford, but we're in the next group of generous people. And in fact, what percentage using the class of 214 as my model here, that is getting the statistics, what percentage of people do you think gets financial aid here? Does anyone want to toss out a guess? Huh? No, it's less than that. It's between 45 and 50. And it varies literally every day. One person comes on. In other words, it's very hard to get an absolute, but it was something like 47%. And the average package here was about, does anyone want to guess that? And this was when tuition was probably in 214, probably 8% less than it is now, 9%. Anyone want to take a guess? It was much more than that. It was between 35 and 40. So, it can turn out that this is very good. We don't give merit scholarships. We give need-based scholarships. So that's some of the news on the College Olympics. And obviously, when I was talking in New York to people concerned with this, I spent a lot of time on that subject. Okay? A lot. And one of the questions that's often asked, too, what is the economic value of a college education? Is it worth it? Is it worth it even if you take massive loans? And the answer is, we're excluding these for-profit colleges, the answer is actually yes. It turns out that going to college is, on balance, economically advantageous, very advantageous, even for those who are studying the humanities. And it's even true for those who are called borderline people. Borderline people means like college boards in the old days. Now I think it's 2,400, right? But the average would be like half or slightly more than half. Like in the old days, they used the number like 900 out of 1,600. That would be, anything under there would be marginal. Even for those people, it's advantageous to go to college. And even people who are, on balance, who are taking loans, are actually paying them off quicker than they did 10 or 15 years ago. Obviously, it is not a good thing to take massive loans, although some of the loan programs now are giving credit for public service jobs, for teaching jobs, and all of these things. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is knowing. There's a great deal that one can know with a little bit of research. And my book obviously tries to point out some of it, but it's not all of it. And you can, and not the only book that does it. But these federal programs change. So that's the first part of the book. The second part of the book is the college experience. And I give suggestions, and there's suggestions supplemented, as I said, by teachers, administrators, professors, on the freshman experience, the sophomore experience, the junior experience, and so forth. And I give some of this is fairly obvious advice, but the first freshman year, I don't know, are any of you freshmen? I spoke to a whole bunch of freshmen last week. Okay, I know you are, Ronnie. And the freshman experience is the first. We know, for example, that you would think that instead of problems at college dividing up into 8, and they all, like you'd say, there's 8 terms, you'll have 1/8 of the problems each year. It turns out there's a great intensification of problems the freshman year, the first 12 weeks, which is sometimes called the red zone. Some people even think it's the first 6 weeks. And in fact, problems on the whole, kind of, even in the first period, gets smaller as the term progresses. But in the book, I talk about things like how to choose classes and how to find professors who are interested in you. Professors, it's important, I think, because you need recommenders. I think one very good piece of one lesson is every term you should try to get to know one professor. If you get only a 50%, you will have done all right, and you'll have 4 referees when you graduate, which is more than you need. It's also true that sometimes for internships, you'll need some after your freshman year, your sophomore year. So it's good to get to know professors. And some of this is just common sense. Professors who are interested in you, grade their papers on time, keep office hours, these are the kind of things that one looks for. And because these are the people who will do your recommendations conscientiously. I mean, one of the things that happens is it's about some fraction of people don't do recommendations at all, even though they say they will. So you need to be kind of shrewd about finding people who are interested in you. I talk in the book, and a few of you have heard me say this in class, about the best things you can do for success in college. What do you suppose the most important thing is? Students now? Alex, what's the most important thing? Okay, time management. Well, time management is important. Taking care of yourself physically and emotionally is important. Getting enough sleep, know when you're in trouble, avoiding alcohol and drugs, and particularly abuse of that, very important, because that is very much part of what causes problems in the red zone. I sometimes say the most important things for success in college are the 3 R's, right? Resilience, resolve, resourcefulness. Okay? Think about that. because the thing that happens the freshman year, it's hard and it happens throughout, but most is disappointment. And you get a poor grade, you find out there's somebody who's smarter than you are, things like that. And you have to, disappointment, falling down and getting up, same motion. That's resilience. Resolve, having a strong will, being able to deal with difficult circumstances, resourcefulness, using the qualities that you have. And so those are some of the things I talk about. And with the freshman year, I talked a lot and I did some research. The importance really of taking care of yourself physically and mentally is important. Choosing classes that you can manage. If you come to a class and it's an advanced class in science and you're not up to it, you have to step back and maybe take a less advanced class, right? And I think that people, particularly in the sciences, I see Jack here, is that need to know what they know and what they don't know, right? You cannot take courses that you're not prepared for. And courses in STEM, everybody knows what STEM stands for, right? Science, technology, engineering, math, right? That's much more tiered. You have to, before you can take the second course, you have to have the preparation that's necessary. So choosing courses, getting help when you can't do the work, but not being afraid of difficult courses is also important. One of the things we see is that sometimes in the freshman year, the people who have the most trouble is people who come from smaller schools or don't have the full training that some students have, say, from the top urban high schools, like Stuyvesant or Bronx High School of Science, like the best private schools. But one of the good news is, at least at Cornell, people who come from backgrounds where perhaps they haven't had as much training, even in the STEM courses, they catch up. They're highly motivated people, and usually, even without the same background, they have the intensity and the work habits to catch up. So that's something that we've sort of learned. And then, as we go through the school year, I talk about the need for how do you choose a major and how do you choose a career. Sometimes people come here and their parents want them to be doctors, and they get here very quickly and they don't want to be doctors or they don't want to be lawyers. But on the whole, it's a good idea, even for young students, to have some provisional plans in mind. And it's good to use extracurricular activities, summer internships to test things. For example, the young person who's taking notes for an article here is working for the Sun, and this is often preparatory to major careers in journalism. Several of the students who I actually had the pleasure of teaching, who are managing editors of the Sun and senior editors of the Sun, have important journalistic positions right now, with the Wall Street Journal, with important online places. And some of you in Ithaca know the Ithaca Voice was founded by the former managing editor of the Sun, and now he has a job with one of the leading political sites, online sites in Washington. So thinking about your plans for the future is a very good thing to do. And I think it's not too early to do that. You can change your mind, but it's good to think about what your career plans are earlier than some people suggest. And it's also good to test yourself, take courses in areas that might interest you, and also do internships, extracurricular activities. All of those things are important to get yourself ready for the next step. Okay? Internships can be very good. The trouble with internships, and there's been a lot of discussion about this, is they favor the wealthy. Kids who are in high school who are in the lower economic strata sometimes can't even afford to take the time to play sports or to play musical instruments, because they have to go earn money so their family can eat. But on a different level, people can do summer internships who don't need to make money, but can get the experience, where people from lower middle class families can't do this. And the intern business is something of a trick. the internship business sort of started with very elite places like NBC and the New York Times would use summer interns because they couldn't hire all of their children and their relatives. So they figured these kids can run around, you know, and and be in the building, and then we don't have to pay them. But more and more companies caught on to this, and more, some hospitals do it now. So the internship is something it's advantageous for the experience, but in fact, and it's been pointed out by legal people, it actually violates minimum wage laws. It's something that probably shouldn't happen. And believe this or not, when I'm giving these talks on the book, I gave kind of a mini book talk. This comes up a lot. I mean, both people, even people who can afford to have their kids not earn money, they're ready to hire lawyers. So this is a big kind of a mess. So when you get to there's stuff in here that I'm not going to repeat about time management, but except it's worth, this is for the student part, and it's worth keeping a log of how you use your time, okay? At any time in your life. Knowing what you're doing at any given moment is really a good thing. So you might try that exercise. I do that exercise. I mean, I do it often, in fact. I know, but knowing that's part of time management. And you, of course, trying to balance your schoolwork. Extracurriculars is more a part of universities now than it used to be. People are teaching in very good ways. They're working, you know, teaching at the prison, they're helping at the library. These are great things, but they take time. And if you're playing a sport, that takes time. And I actually have there, just mentioning sports, some specialized advice about people who think they're going to be Olympic athletes and not to be gulled by coaches who tell you that come here and you're going to be the star of the team and things like that. Sometimes coaches' interest and your interest are not aren't the same. Now, one of the things I talk about in terms of the undergraduate experience is there's three areas, I think, and again, I've had a lot of input that you need to take courses in. One is economics. You need to know something about money and how it works, okay? Two is you have to be computer literate. You have to, I mean, a lot of students now take the basic CS course if you had a little preparation in that area, but sometimes you have to take a kind of prelim and learn a little bit before you can be in that course. I found out from one of my freshman advisees who couldn't manage that course. But you need to have computer literacy. You need to have financial literacy. And now I'm going to segue a little bit into the humanities. You need the humanities. And the humanities are several different things. Reading, what do the humanities do? I think I'm going to give now for my colleagues and for everybody, a little bit of a talk on the humanities. The humanities help us to understand ourselves and the world in which we live. When we read, we listen to words, we respond to behavior, we try to judge what people's mindset is. So humanities means reading human behavior every day in our interaction with colleagues, family, friends, and public figures. One of the things that learning to read, learning to understand the arts, theater, opera, dance, classical music does is it enriches your life. This is what I call the joy of learning. So far, we've been talking about the practicality. So you should not miss a chance in your college years to take part in these and to save time for a course in art appreciation, or a basic course, Introduction to Art, in one particular period, or to music. These are really important parts of your life. And so the arts are crucial, and you should certainly, no matter what you're studying, allow them to be part of your life. The humanities contributes to our moral, historical, and political awareness. And this occurs even if the events described in a literary text, or a painting, or a sculpture, or an operatic or theatrical performance are more imaginative than factually accurate. I mean, one of the things I was talking about in one of my classes this week, Ronnie, was how we understand Putin better if we have read Dostoevsky and if we Tolstoy, and if we know something about Russian history. Putin claims to have read Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and Putin claims to be part of a Russian Orthodox believer, even though for a long time he was a member of the Communist Party, and in fact didn't claim to be religious. But now he wears a cross around all the time that his mother gave him, supposedly, which is possible. But the point is that Putin is taking his cue from, and we understand that from knowing something about Russian history and Russian literature, from the idea that the Russians are different from the Westerners. The Westerners, according to Putin and according to Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, are basically utilitarians. They do everything rationally. They're descended from the European Enlightenment. They think differently from the Russians, supposedly. Everything descends from logic, and as Dostoevsky writes in The Underground Man, from 2 + 2 makes 4. We try to think logically. But Putin claims that there's a different way of thinking, which is basically something he derives from the Russian mystics of the 19th century, people like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, who think there's something special about the Russian soul. It's a kind of exceptionalism, which of course Trump likes in Putin. But it's a kind that but this really is derived, his argument derives from a group of people who believed that Russia thought differently, that they had different way, and that they thought that the Western way was kind of was both the Western sort of age of reason, but even their kind of romanticizing the good and beautiful were something different from this kind of intuitive feeling that Russian has. And though he thinks of himself a little bit as the heir to the 19th century czars and special. And you learn that from really from knowing literature. So your understanding is increased by that. Another example, which is of how you know more from literature, is you can understand Irish history both from knowing something about it, but from some of the works by people like Yeats and people like Joyce. In other words, the debate between Joyce and Yeats about the direction of Irish culture, which was a debate between really a Western perspective, a Western European perspective of Joyce, who calls his best known book Ulysses, and Yeats, who thought that Ireland should be have a separate mythology, separate language, Celtic, although Yeats was very strong that everybody should read Celtic, but wrote all his poems in English, but we'll leave that out, because he wanted people to read him. But the point being that this debate informs our understanding of what happens in Ireland, and particularly what's going on in Northern Ireland. I mean, a poem like Easter 1916 talks about the Eastern Uprising, which is a kind of really a tragic event turned into, by literature, into a magical, mythical event. The idea, basically, about 1,000 people got killed for no good reason, and the people who started this, 15 people, well, 15 of them were hung, but it was really a failed rebellion, a military disaster. But it became a kind of mythicized by Yeats into something that propelled Ireland forward to actually free themselves from England in the 1922-23 period. So there's an interesting example of how literature can affect events. So the humanities really matter. And I could go on with this. I mean, for example, Conrad's Heart of Darkness, with its stress on European imperial greed and racist exploitation of Africans, Africans actually not only helped us understand the history of the country, which is now called the Democratic Republic of Congo, formerly the Belgium Congo, but it also helped us it helps Britain understand the cost of imperialism. It had an effect, it had as much effect on Britain and exploitive colonies, and it probably was sort of a pathway to another important book, which taught us a good deal about what was going on in the British Empire, A Passage to India, which helped us understand India, where we remember in these days, we didn't, when Conrad and Foster published these works, we didn't have CNN, we didn't have television, right? People didn't know. Photography made a great deal of difference, and we learned that too from the humanities. We go to museums and we find how things were, right? Before photography, we didn't really know what things looked like, okay? The Passage to India helped us to understand India, the continued divide between Muslims and Hindus, and the more recent efforts in India to move beyond the caste system. So all of these things, we learn a great deal from the humanities about other things. And we also can learn, I mean, I don't want to go back to Putin, but again, the seizure of Ukraine really derives from his sense that there's a mystical Russia beyond Russia, that it's the old USSR. And he, in fact, believes and has said that the reason the USSR declined and was broken apart is that the Russians accepted the Western arguments that they had lost the war, and no war was ever fought. That's what Putin says. They lost the war that never was fought. So all of these things point up the value of the humanities. Another thing that we want to talk about, we've talked about the joy and practicality of education. And I'm stressing that the arts and even reading history, these are open a lifetime of pleasure. And I think that's something very much that we want to stress. But there's something else we get out of college that we also should focus on. And it's particularly apt now is this time when we have one presidential candidate who really doesn't use the evidentiary test, but rather a kind of performative test of language. It's a different way of speaking. One of the things we get from college, particularly in small classes, but also in the dorms, is we really learn the roots of democracy. We learn how to respond to other people. We learn how to take ideas, test them, respond using an evidentiary test. We learn the dialogue among us that allows space for other points of view, allows people to present perspectives, and learns how to respond to them. Whether we're talking about immigration, poverty, what education should do, triggers and microaggressions. In other words, these very subjects, we should be able to tolerate difference, and we learn not only from the wonderful diversity at the university, but from the diversity of ideas. And hopefully we're tolerant of difference. So these are things that we get from the small classes and hopefully from the humanities, that ideas are tested and we learn how to participate. Other advantages of what I consider the humanities, but also a college education, and I assume this includes STEM, but certainly in the classes that in the history, the humanities, and even some of the social sciences, we learn how to think critically. We learn how to read and with some skepticism. We learn, for example, that everything we read is not true, right? We learn each person is telling his own narrative. You learn that even in class. We don't have a univocal system. So we participate in democracy and we learn to test ideas. And this is a very important thing. The other thing we learned we should come out of college with is to learn how to write. Writing is hard, and we all writing is, as I said to my class, writing is hell, and writing is hell, and having written is great, right? So you want it, writing precisely is very important. And the other thing is to learn how to speak articulately. For the students, learning how to express themselves in classes are extremely important. Doing that from a very early age is important. So think critically, read powerfully, speak articulately, write precisely, coherently. All of these things are really great skills that you learn at college and are really important aspect of the humanities, right? So those are some of the things I talk about in the book in detail. And I talk a lot about how we learn and what we learn from literary texts. As I said, I did a little bit with the Putin stuff, and I could have done more with that part because but basically, I talk in the book a good deal about Putin and how his quotations, Russia is not Europe, and how he has a kind of unique view of state government, and a lot of his view also comes from the fact that Napoleon and Hitler had invaded Russia and the historical memory of those events. But so that's so we make a strong case for the humanities. I have a chapter, why study the arts and humanities? Do the humanities help us understand the world in which we live? And then the what to do with a bachelor in English. And that one we know because Huffington keeps score, was one of the most read ones. It's every time somebody posts that, it gets a big. And the good news here, as I said, is that people who study the humanities get jobs. And I did a fair amount of research on this subject, but a great many English majors from Cornell, they're more likely to be in medical school, law schools, working. A lot of them are working in digital humanities, helping companies make money. In some of the places that are maybe not elite schools, and some of our students go on to be secondary school teachers. But there are jobs for people in the humanities, and that's kind of good news, okay? One of the controversial chapters in the book, certainly the most controversial, was a discussion about sororities and fraternities. Should you join the Greek system? And I came down on that somewhat on the negative side, although there were some people who thought that I was pillorying them. And that's a very important decision for undergraduates, and it does somewhat relate to things parents should think about too. I mean, this chapter got a lot of attention, and some people thought that I was a bad guy for thinking that maybe the Greek system at a place like Cornell is obsolete. The Greek system has been abolished at Williams and Amherst in Middlebury, and they've survived. What does Cornell is not a complete Greek school, it's 1/3 Greek. And what is the argument against the Greek system? Well, the argument is it encourages homogeneity. That is, people of the same social class tend to join, and even if they come from diverse backgrounds, that is, let us say there is a generally Caucasian fraternity, but there are some Afro-Americans and some Asians, we find out that they're often not people, they're people from the same socioeconomic backgrounds. In other words, they're not as diverse as you would think. So they're doctors' children, if something like that. So we don't get what we would like there in diversity. And we find in the fraternities that there's more drinking, more underage drinking, more sexual abuse, more that hazing at least has not been abolished here. Much of my evidence comes from here. So we see a lot of things that aren't so good in the fraternity system. And the argument for it is that people say they make lifetime friends. And one of the things that I learned from the fraternity system is that if you talk in groups to a group of fraternity people, when the students are all there who are members, you get a different kind of input than if you talk to people one-on-one in your office. And when you talk one-on-one, a lot of the students say the major reason they belonged is because they didn't make enough friends, and they feel this is a way to make a quick batch of friends. Does it do some good for people? Very much so. I mean, some people find this an important part of life here. But fraternities were formed, and sororities too. And I might make a parenthetic comment. Sororities here are a lot less toxic than the fraternities. There's partly because the women live in them only for 1 year, and there's fewer of them, and there's more variety. Okay, but this is not necessarily true nationally. But and nationally, we find that there's a lot of time wasted in fraternities and sororities. There's some, and not a big sister, little sister, a lot of stuff which is just nonsense, but takes up a great deal of time. But when Cornell was founded and fraternities were founded a couple of decades later, there were no other activities on campus except a few teams. Now there's over 1,000 activities, so there's many different ways to bond and find a place, and this is true of other places too. There's much more choices. Here we have the residential colleges. So this is a little bit practical, and maybe when we get to questions, which we will in a minute, because we said 40 minutes talk. So I talk about that issue, and the reason I mentioned it is because when I wrote about it, I got a lot of input, some of which was that I don't know what I'm talking about. And it was very interesting, too. There was a site which was totally anonymous that I was pilloried on, and yet all of the people who commented, none of them signed their names. I went right on the site. I said, this is who I am. Let's talk about it. No one, and every single person who was on the negative side, every single one was male, not one female. And when I've talked about this, when on my mini book tour, again, many women will say right out in the group, this is exactly right. The women, sexual abuse, drinking, people taking advantage. So the last section of the book, which is what I call Perspectives of a Professor. And I talk about things like teaching students, some of my philosophy of teaching. This came from, original version was in a kind of booklet which is called Weiss Fellows Wisdom. Some of you know what the Weiss Fellows are. But it basically they asked me to write about some of my teaching ideas. And I called it the classroom as opportunity, because it's a place to learn. And one of the things, the opportunity for real good teachers, it's an opportunity for us to learn. One of the things I tell my students, and maybe I should stop here, is and it's because it pertains, in fact, to what I'm doing today. Everything that I'm saying today, I think is true. But it may be that I find out some things aren't true. And the example I give, a few years ago, I gave a prestigious lecture here I was asked to give a lecture on Darwin and modern literature. It's the harder lecture. Carol, you'll probably get asked to give this at some point. And it's sort of like, and so I thought, this isn't going to be hard. I've been talking about Darwin in my lecture class, and I sort of left it a little bit to the summer to start reading and being sure I knew what I was talking about, and I read the recent books on Darwin. I didn't know what I was talking about at all. I had been taught about the upward, how evolution was some sort of an upward teleology. I had even been taught that in graduate school, I had taken a course that had a Darwin component. I didn't know at all what I was talking about. And I had to do a great deal of reading. Someone reminded me of this lecture this morning, that to be able to give it. And often, as you can see, I lecture with very minimal notes, sometimes none at all. But in fact, I read much of this lecture, but on the part that was on the Darwin part, because I wanted to be sure I got it exactly right. But upward teleology is not at all natural selection. And you can have 8 different kinds of finches in 8 different islands in the Galapagos. Well, we all know that now, but I didn't. And a second example of this, and this is one time where I did do the correcting. There's a famous Wallace Stevens poem. Some of you may know it, The Man with the Blue Guitar. And so I'm reading the books on Stevens. I'm starting to get interested in Stevens, and I wrote a book about the relationship between art and literature, but I think the Stevens book came first. So I'm reading away, and I think, everybody says it's based on the poem. Stevens' poem is based on the picture of Picasso's The Man with the Blue Guitar. So, well, I think that's interesting, and one good critic after another repeats this. Well, I happen to decide, well, let's go to the museum in Chicago and see what this thing looks like. Well, it turns out that the guitar is not blue. And it also turns out that once you begin to study the subject, he mentions Picasso. There's probably 7 or 8 that I could find paintings, not in several different museums, that feed into this. So, and this was a case where I did the work and corrected other people, but it can work both ways. And probably the first time I taught the poem, I said the same stupid thing because I read it in critical books. So the point is, and this is really part of what I call the joy of learning, there are things to find out. There's nothing more fun than the mind working curiously, and I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Good? And thanks for coming. Questions, Jeff?
I just had a question about, in your research on the fraternity sorority system, if you had come across Wesleyan University's decision. I just wondered.
The whole thing's being filmed.
I wondered if you had come across in your research about the Greek system, Wesleyan University's decision recently, under duress from its president, to integrate all fraternities on that campus. Now, there were no sororities, but by that I mean all the fraternities had to become co-ed or cease to exist. And I wondered if you had read about that or figured out how it went.
I've read about that, and other people I've talked about. It's been talked about at Dartmouth where they've had a lot of problems. But I guess I come down on that. That's probably a good idea, although like here where we have Walsh as a female dorm, you might have some, I think co-eding these fraternity sorority system would be good. I think men and women living together is a good thing. I would have to study, I'm giving you an off the cuff. I could answer somewhat because I'd have to see, if there are women or say gay women who want to live not integrated, there have to be some provisions made for other people. So, but again, I don't want to be put in the position of talking about Darwin before I know what I'm talking about. Go ahead, Seth.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful talk. And I guess I'll ask the question that may be on many people's minds. And if my Facebook feed is anything to be believed, the big debate in undergraduate education right now is, of course, the letter that the Dean of Students at the University of Chicago sent to the incoming freshman class about safe spaces and trigger. Yeah. And just this week, the letter signed by 150 Chicago faculty published in the Chicago newspaper responding to that. And I'm just wondering, even though I know that this is something that's not directly addressed in your book, your vision of the humanities, which resonates with mine, needs to speak to these issues. And I'm wondering how, for students and faculty, you can give us a productive way of talking about it. You see, I'm not so much asking, what do you think, should we have them or not? Right. How can we have a conversation that's productive without being divisive?
I think that's a very good question. Some people here know that I actually have about 5,000 Twitter and Facebook followers, partly because that was part of I never did any of this till I wrote the book on the New York Times, and the publishers told me to do this, befriend anybody who's not a jerk. And people know I do that. So I've discussed that there, but I think that's a very, very difficult question. On the whole, I put it, how do you balance diversity? And I think I do touch a little bit on some of this in my book, actually, but how do you balance the respect for diversity with the legitimate feelings of some people? And I think another context before I answer that, or 2 sentences, is the article about Oberlin in the New Yorker and some of the commentary on that. and one of the things that was disturbing there is the young woman who says, I don't want to be changed at all at college. College is a place to be changed, to test yourself, to think about taking things in fields you never thought of. That's really what I've been preaching today. And I think that the idea that if somebody has had a bad experience that shouldn't and wants to leave the room, I used to have kiddingly, I'm trying, maybe even Gwen may have seen this, I'm trying to think who's in my upper class courses. I say when I do my lecture on art, and I do a lot with Lame Damoiselle d'Avignon or Lawrence, I say everybody doesn't want to hear about sex can leave the room. I used to do that jokingly because I knew everybody would pay attention twice as well. Oh boy, we're going to see some pictures of naked people, and So I think I've probably come down closer to with respect for diversity, but I don't think every time somebody says something to me that's microaggression. I mean, but there are things that are extreme. I mean, I talked about web pages. One of the things I didn't mention about the fraternity system, someone pointed to me to a site on this campus where the women are rated by sorority and occasionally by names, and it's all anonymous. It's totally disgusting. And that's more than microaggression. That's almost macroaggression. But I think that we have to talk we have to talk about things that were unpleasant, and we talk about, we talk about loneliness, we talk about falling apart, we talk about the need for psychoanalysis. I mean, some people, if people are offended by that, maybe you can find somebody who's offended by everything. I'm sure, I think we live every day, people walk by us in the hall and they forget to say hello, particularly if we're graduates, and we worry about that, and when we're younger. I think we have to realize that there's going to be certain discomforts in classrooms. But certainly we don't want people, attacked by gender or by sexuality. I mean, I think also it's actually about how you choose your referees. It's a professor who creates a comfort zone, I mean, we had a creative writing here once. I'm not going to mention who failed. And this guy was reducing students to tears. And unfortunately, I was acting chair. And I mean, it was just, that's absolutely ridiculous, and he didn't grade his papers. In fact, my last statement to him, and we were actually on fairly good terms, I said, I wouldn't even say his first name because it's pretty well known. I said, X, I said, if you better hope I don't teach here for a long time, because if I do, you won't be coming back. So there's a behavior that's unsuitable, and I think the tone in a classroom, I mean, what I call my classes, and some of them knows this, is like I use the term community of inquiry, and we try to create a community where people respect one another, and if somebody doesn't, I've had graduate seminars where one or two students you take them to lunch and you see if you can figure out, you don't want that atmosphere. So that's sort of my fudgy answer. John?
Thank you very much for that talk, and I really like your defense of the humanities. I wanted to ask you, said it was important for students to study economics, to study some computer skills, and study the humanities. And out in life, those different values come together in one big place, whether it's a business or a nonprofit. In higher education, where's a place that those different things can be studied, not separately, but together, and to learn how to integrate those values? Yeah,
I've read some of your statements about integrative learning, and I should have added, really, and not just because Jack's here, everyone should study, we're required here, but hard science, too, at the level they can do it. But in other words, we want to know as much as we can about the world. Integrating in these things, I mean, I don't have a course that integrates them, but obviously if we can have courses or programs that integrate them, like science and technology, and I know George has a fellowship from the sustainability group. I mean, we're trying to do that, and some of us, teach in different fields. I do some work in Jeff left. That was Stephanie Wild's husband, who was here a minute ago, who asked the first question. But, so we teach in different areas. I mean, and if certainly somebody can teach all of these things at once, that's good. But I think the undergrad, I mean, we're right now working, as you know, on an undergraduate curriculum. Laura Brown, who is chairing a committee on that, we need to continue to rethink curriculum, and certainly, hopefully, if you go to a good major university like this, you have opportunities to do that. Do you have ideas about integrating them into one course or program?
Well, obviously, it could be done some sort of team teaching when you bring people together and then have a certain problem solved around a set of problems. There are also ways to bring in, to mix seminar experiences with studio experiences, with laboratory experiences. Yeah, I mean, those are two off the top of my head.
Team teaching.
Well, and also project teams bringing together. There's a game design minor on campus, and I know they bring together engineers and artists, and so they get something, maybe they need a business person in there too, and then they could solve some problems around there. So I think there are things happening here already. I was just wondering your thoughts.
Well, I mean, those things or anything like that is good. I mean, I've been in team courses, and there's strengths and weaknesses of team teaching. I've done that. I mean, there used to be Jim McConkey, who you guys really didn't know, but was honored here for his 95th birthday last week, used to have a course that kind of brought a lot of faculty together and talked about issues of things like memory, and they were attended, they were open to the community, and there were a couple of credits. But yeah, well, anything that brings interesting people together to talk is good. I mean, sometimes when you have this collaborative teaching, the students don't have some a one-person contact. So we've had some of those courses I've been involved in have been better than others, even though the intent was good. But sure, anything that's learning and teaching is great. I mean, why not? I mean, as long as it's something that's valuable. Does anyone else have a question? You have one. Go ahead.
Thanks for the lecture. It was fantastic. Back to the question about fraternities. What are your thoughts on professional fraternities? Are they as bad as...
Well, I mean, we have to be, a few people know, I mean, I'm president of Phi Beta Kappa here. I don't know if that's a professional fraternity. It's a different, I don't think of that as a fraternity. Every once in a while, because it's really, it's an honor. But I don't know much, I'm going to be honest, I don't know much about professional fraternities. I do know that there's a lot of fraternities on campus that honored different achievements. And I know we were presented a few years ago, and I guess I was the one who was the kind of presentee. It was presented to me, I think, because I was head of the literary club. Somebody wanted to have an English fraternity, national English fraternity or something here, and we didn't think we needed that, and we just let that go. But I mean, there's a lot of these things. I mean, one thing that happens with Phi Beta Kappa is that some of the same students are asked who are from like China, they don't know what it is, and eventually, when we explain it, we get almost 100% of the juniors we ask. But first, they don't know, and so some of them have been asked to join lots of fraternities and pay some money. And so I guess this is what do you think? I mean, as we say in New York, what are we talking about? Because I'm not sure. Carol, you reckon, right? I'm not sure what we're talking about. What do you? Give me an example.
I mean, chemistry fraternities, and fraternities like that. That are there's obviously a social aspect to it, but would you say that overrides the professionalism or the professional aspect of it?
Sounds to me. I mean, from what I know of these, which little are, we should put in parentheses, little, they're a good idea. Maybe, what do you think? Are they good ideas, the chemistry fraternities? Yeah, is this a good thing for them to belong to? He's one of the leading chemists at Cornell. Perhaps the
as an undergraduate, in my senior year, I actually joined it, but it was hazing and whatnot. It tried to be like a
Right.
non-focused fraternity.
Right.
And as a result, I've had nothing to do with it since.
I see. Well, yeah, I'm very much opposed to hazing. I mean, one of the things that's happened at Cornell is that we've declared the end of hazing many times, and it hasn't happened. And the same fraternities, not here, have been thrown off campus time and again. And my own view is that once they throw them off campus, they shouldn't let them back. There's a couple of fraternities that have been thrown off in my 49 years here 4 times. And since I had several terms when I was teaching elsewhere, for all I know, it's 6 times. So not good. So, but I'm very much opposed to hazing. I think that's dehumanizing. I think it's, you know, it's a kind of ultimate form of disrespect. I think, for me, any and all hazing, bad. Anyone else? Yes? Go ahead.
One more question.
Sure.
I teach high school English locally here. And so one of the questions that I have, there's a force at the high school level to really, push student engagement. So student, choice, adding, more choices in literature and courses and things like that. Do you find that undergraduates are coming a little less prepared in their canonical knowledge and their ability to kind of read widely and deeply in the humanities courses as undergrads? Have you noticed a trend in that?
Well, there's no question that they know less canonical literature. I mean, because they can take courses in non-canonical literature, some of which may be very valuable. But even when I'm teaching upper class course on Ulysses, and I ask who's read Vanity Fair, they're going to be a much smaller number than in the past. It happens that the hero in Ulysses is somewhat derived from one in Vanity Fair. But the second, so I would say definitely yes, less canonical. And, but on the positive side, read deeply and powerfully, that's not so bad. You can teach that, and we're doing that right. It happens this year. I'm teaching a freshman class, which I do every once in a while, and I'm doing, and it's like a sort of a AP one, where the students have 5s or 7 on there, 6 or 7 on there. So they're very good, and they learn how to read powerfully, and they have learned. Some of them know that. They actually in this class, which has a fair number of people who were born elsewhere, their reading is probably superior to some of their writing. And of course, writing, the other thing is writing is not taught as strictly as it once was. And the people who grade these AP exams are not as fussy, truthfully, as they might have been one time. And so that's to be honest about it. So is there but I will say this, and this is a question I was often asked on my mini book tour. The students now are just as good, if not better, than the past. They are terrific. And they say one thing that saves them a lot of time is the computer. It's for my field. They can look up things, and also they can write drafts upon drafts. When I was in college, what we did is we retyped our papers, and at 3 in the morning we'd be typing on the register because we were so tired. The paper wasn't there anymore. And so, and the professors insisted that it'd be neat, so you had to retype the stupid thing. They didn't even let you type, paste on a sentence. So the students are very, very good, and they're very motivated. Anyone else? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Thank you for coming.